Track 30, push back musical boundaries, but not at the expense of accessibility. For this one, we got this colour photo printer that takes, you can connect up to your phone and it prints you a colour photo in the moment. But while it's doing it, it had this unbelievably complicated, like music, sounds, chords, frequencies, squeaks. It had everything. And it's impossible to believe that so many sounds were required in order to produce this, just to print a colour photo. And I just listened, every time we print out a photo, I'd be listening to it and listening to all these intricacies. And then the lift off of the track, the departure point for the track was to try and get a string quartet to imitate the colour printer, and then they kind of I'd shop between the recording of the actual colour printer and then the string quartet and me as an arranger trying to mimic, and not really getting very far actually necessarily. So you've got this battle between the string quartet and the colour printer, and that was the track. It's like the most experimental sounding, the most wacky sounding track, I think, and it was one where I can remember I was sort of asking myself, do I have the bottle to actually put this on when it is so wacky, and then I decided I was quite proud of myself to allow this particularly odd track to go on the album and to have such a significant, I feel like the last tracks on an album have a significant place. I feel like this is like a spotlight, the last few tracks, and to put it in that place was it took a bit of a deep breath to allow myself to do that. Push back musical boundaries, but not at the expense of accessibility. This is from a call for works from an orchestra. They're asking people to make proposals for writing music, and in this call, they said, you can imagine. It's a bit unfair, but I can imagine an idiot writing this. You've got to write a piece that pushes back musical boundaries, but not at the expense of accessibility. I just feel like, this is what I think, is that I really like not fretting. I wouldn't encourage people to fret about pushing back musical boundaries. I feel like, at face value, it makes sense. Yes, we want people to be doing new music, but we don't want it to be too new. I think this is part of something that I would advise people not to do, basically. I think you can very easily fret your way into thinking about pushing back, I must push back musical boundaries, or also that I must be accessible. And I think fretting about either of those things can get you nowhere. I feel like there's people who do actually push back musical boundaries, you're much less likely to do it if you set out to every day say I must do something completely novel every day. I think that's not necessarily a good starting point for the artistic process. And in exactly the same way, but in an opposite way, I suppose, worrying about how accessible your work is. If you put that in your mind that it must be accessible, you're starting to predict what other people are going to think, and then I think that's a complete no-go, because it's an impossibility. You cannot predict how someone will respond to something, even once you get to even given huge amounts of experience. You just cannot do that. No one should have the arrogance that they can do that, and so it's both of these things are best left alone, I think.